Good morning. We light this candle in recognition of the Thaman and Muwekma Ohlone indigenous peoples, who were the first humans to inhabit and sustain this land thousands of years before settler colonizers arrived. We honor the resilience of these indigenous peoples in the face of devastating harm, and we lift up the resilience of their neighboring tribe to the south, the Ama Mutsun tribal band, with whom we are now working to preserve their sacred land of Heuristic. Oh, my goodness, I actually practiced that. To ensure that their culture continues to thrive.
We light this candle with the light of truth, the warmth of love, and the energy of service. If you're joining us on Zoom, please write in the chat where you're lighting your chalice from.
The intricate tapestry of history that we all carry within us. Today we honor the resilience and strength of those who endured unimaginable hardships as we reflect on the legacy of slavery and the long shadow it cast over generations. In this space and time today, in this month of recognition, let us acknowledge the painful chapters of our history, recognizing the deep wounds inflicted by slavery, Jim Crow laws, and systemic racism. And as we confront this collective past, we draw inspiration from the courage of Martin Luther King Jr., a beacon of hope during tumultuous times. King's unwavering commitment to nonviolence and justice serves as a guiding light for us all. And in the face of adversity, he stood firm, echoing the teachings of love and equity that transcend the boundaries of time and circumstance. May our hearts be open to the lessons of history, and may we find strength in our shared pursuit of a world guided by justice, compassion, and the transformative power of love. In honoring our interconnectedness, let us unite in the spirit of justice that transcends generations and propels us towards a more equitable and compassionate future. Let us worship together.
Please rise as you're willing and able, and join me in saying the affirmation of our church. Love is the doctrine of this church.
The quest of truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek truth and freedom, to serve
Our first hymn this morning is number 118, This Little Light of Mine. Well, on this beautiful sunny morning, welcome to worship at the First Unitarian Church of San Jose. My name is Ram Kakarala. My pronouns are he, him. I am a worship associate for today. Our welcome is deep and inclusive. We welcome you, whatever your religious background, whomever you love, whatever your gender. We are all inherently worthy. We're all welcome to worship here. If you are new or visiting, please join us after service for social hour and coffee. It's in that room to my left. I'd like to give a shout out to those who are joining by Zoom. We will have a moment where we will show the video feeds from all of our members on Zoom, and we will have a chance to wave to them. There's a camera that will pan around the sanctuary up over there, and when it does, please join in waving to our members on Zoom. There we go. I'd like to make two announcements for today. Okay. The first is that last week we kicked off our annual giving campaign. A key part of that is pledge parties, fun events that take place at a member's house or on Zoom. I'm hosting one this evening. There's plenty of space. Please do join us if you can. There's another one coming up this Thursday on Zoom, and there are others planned. Please stop by the stewardship table in Harry Porter Hall after the service to RSVP for a pledge party or to drop off your pledge form. Every pledge counts in helping our church achieve its mission of making love visible in all that we say and do. My second announcement is that there will be a celebration of life for Nancy Prince on Saturday, the 17th at 1 p.m. here in the church. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guest minister. Reverend Clovice Lois is a professional cellist and composer who composed his first symphony at the age of 17. And he was a professor of computer music at UC Santa Barbara from 1978 to 1986. He has also been a serial entrepreneur and software designer for the past 30 years. In addition to music and technology, he has had a lifelong passion for aviation and has been a private pilot since 1987. Reverend Lewis received a Master of Divinity from Star King in 2021 and was ordained a UU minister in 2022. His ministry emphasizes breaking down racial, class, and ethnic barriers and preaching the gospel of the madness of human self-extinction. So welcome, Reverend Lewis. And now we'll have our time for all ages.
This material was removed from the video to respect copyright.
And there's a place in all of us that's hidden. It seeks expression, but is laden with layers of hurt and disappointment. Loving is hard work. It calls us to set aside the fear of rejection, the disappointment of expectations, and the sting of hurtful barbs. It is not only the oppressed who hurt, it is also the oppressor who must deny their own humanity to maintain an impossible facade. Let us look to each other in this moment. Let us acknowledge our frailty and the weakness of our humanity. But let us also recognize the children in us who know only how to love. And it's that quality in our collective psyche that the great teacher Jesus called on us to summon. It is the same quality that Martin Luther King Jr. evoked when he told us of the dream he had for his children. Let us reflect on these things as we enter into this place of quiet meditation.
Our first reading this morning is from the King Center. It's titled About Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, Nobel Peace Prize lecture, and letter from the Birmingham jail are among the most revered orations and writings in the English language. His accomplishments are now taught to American children of all races, and his teachings are studied by scholars and students worldwide. He is the only non-president to have a national holiday dedicated in his honor, and is the only non-president memorialized on the Great Mall in the nation's capital. He is memorialized in hundreds of statues, parks, streets, and squares, churches, and other public facilities around the world as a leader whose teachings are increasingly relevant to the progress of humankind. Our second reading is in the Gray Hymnal. It's a responsive reading. Please open to 576.
This material was removed from the video to respect copyright.
And now let's join in the next hymn, number 121 in the Gray Hymnal, We'll Build the Land.
My great-great-grandparents on both sides of my family were born into slavery. They were property to be sold and traded like livestock. Surprisingly, I've traced the ancestry on my mother's side back to the 1830s, to a Julianne bourgeois in Waveland, Mississippi. My great-grandfather, John Henry Lewis, was born just after the Civil War, and I can find no significant records about his parents nor his wife, who I know as Fannie Mae Wright. As slaves, my ancestors, living in the Deep South before the Civil War, were subjected to cruelty and brutal conditions that we can now scarcely imagine. And it seems that my mother's side of the family was fairly well treated. There was a vital French component to her bloodline. Records were better kept for slaves who worked closer to their masters' families because house servants tended to be treated with something approaching kindness. I don't believe the same could be said of my father's grandparents. I think they fit the more classic picture of generations of people brought and sold into slavery with all the attendant horror of those times. We all know that slaves were punished by whipping, branding, mutilation, hanging, burning, beating, and so on. I think everyone in this country needs to see the film 12 Years a Slave. It depicts the brutality of that time far better than I can say here. I know that when my grandparents and parents lived in the Deep South, the Jim Crow laws replaced the slave codes. Jim Crow was the name of the racial caste system which operated primarily, but not exclusively, in southern and border states between 1877 and the mid-1960s. Jim Crow was more than a series of rigid anti-Black laws. It was a way of life. Jim Crow represented the legitimization of anti-Black racism. According to the Ferris State University Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia, yes, there is such a place, the following beliefs and rationalizations undergirded the Jim Crow system. Whites are superior to blacks in all important ways, including but not limited to intelligence, morality, and civilized behavior. Sexual relations between blacks and whites would produce a mongrel race, which would destroy America. So treating blacks as equals would encourage interracial sexual unions. Any activity which suggested social equality encouraged such relations. Violence was used if necessary to keep Black people at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. Of course, in the back of my grandparents' and parents' minds was the real threat and possibility of being lynched. Lynchings took place most frequently in the southern United States from 1890 to the 1920s, with a peak in the annual toll in 1892. It's associated with the reimposition of white supremacy in the South after the Civil War. Black Americans, and importantly some poorer white Americans, in pursuing integration rights, were regularly lynched in the South during Reconstruction. And here I have to say, sometimes when I would go down to Mobile, Alabama as a child, I would be afraid. And I never knew exactly what that was, but living with my aunt and Fowl River, those dark southern nights, I didn't know what it was at the time, but I understand now that it was an epigenetic echo. So even though slavery was ended by the time my grandparents and parents were born, its insidious Jim Crow remnant lived on. And even now, when I talk to people of my parents' generation about what it was like to live during the Jim Crow era, they practically shudder to dredge up those memories. My Uncle Joe, a well-known jazz player, saxophonist on the Gulf Coast, still plays. He tells me it still makes him very nervous when white women come to talk to him at the clubs he plays in. The old fear of being physically harmed to do so is still with him. And my father sometimes tells me about his own experiences with racism he and my mother had during that era, but only when I ask. There's even now a deep resentment and pain buried inside them that I most times can't even reach. But my mother is funny. It still gives her goosebumps to be served at Howard Johnson restaurants. Of course, in Mobile, Alabama, where she grew up, she considered those restaurants the height of culinary excellence. But they wouldn't serve her there. So I'll tell you, when my mother sees the orange roofs of a Howard Johnson's, it brings a particular kind of smile to her face. My father was born just 4 years after Martin Luther King Jr., who was born in 1929. They both lived during the Jim Crow era, described as slavery by another name. Many of King's detractors cite his failings as a reason to discredit him as a national hero and role model. These detractors like to talk about mainly his extramarital dalliances and his academic weaknesses. King is reported to have been quite a womanizer. In fact, in the book And the Walls Came Tumbling Down, his best friend, Ralph Abernathy, describes King's last night on the planet as a time when he sexually entertained 3 women to whom he was not married. The FBI is supposed to have made covert recordings of that night, complete with clinking glasses and unmistakable sounds. King's well-rumored dalliances with the opposite sex were not the only way he was known to be a cheater. Much has been made about his famous penchant towards plagiarism. King's plagiarism was very well documented, even to the point where some scholars have claimed that he certainly plagiarized at least 50% of his scholarly work at both the Boston University, where he did his undergraduate work, and at Crozer Theological Seminary. His detractors point out that even his name is a fraud. He was born the son of a black preacher known at that time only as Daddy King. In 1935, Daddy King decided to name himself after the Protestant reformer Martin Luther. He declared to his congregation that henceforth they were to refer to him as Martin Luther King and his son as Martin Luther King Jr. None of his name changing was ever legalized in court. Daddy King's son's real name to this day is Michael King, not Martin King. King said of his involvement in the civil rights movement that he was drafted into it, and he was more interested in obtaining a doctorate in theology than being involved. Indeed, some detractors have said that King wanted a PhD in theology because he wanted to be superior to other black preachers. King later wrote, "I didn't have to worry about anything. I was to conclude that my life was wrapped up for me in a Christmas package. Everything was done for me. And if I had a problem, I could always call Daddy. Things were solved." But one day, after finishing school, I was called to a little black church down in Montgomery, Alabama, and I started preaching there. Things were going well. But one day, a year later, a lady by the name of Rosa Parks decided that she wasn't going to take it any longer. It was the beginning of a movement, and the people of Montgomery asked me to serve as their spokesman. I couldn't say no. My friends, it is essential to note that King was only 24 years old when he was asked to serve as the spokesman for the people in Montgomery. Detractors aside, it is clear that fame was thrust upon King. He did not seek any office or capacity other than being an effective preacher. And I contend that while it is very true that fame was thrust upon King, his courage was not. That came from a deep well. And the reason why I spent so much time at the beginning of this address to paint a picture of the legal, social, moral, and spiritual environment that people of my parents and King's generation lived in is for us to consider just how dangerous it was for King to do what he did. Now, here's the point. I don't care what King's failings were. The thing I care about is the amazing depth of his courage. I care about his message of nonviolence. I care about his call to end poverty and wars fought to keep people economically derived and deprived. I care about the sacrifices he made to keep the dream of racial equality alive in our country. I care that King understood his role in history and was prepared to fight a righteous battle no matter the consequences. Now, the King home was bombed on January 30th, 1956, about 8 months before I was born. According to Taylor Branch, King had been speaking at a mass meeting at the First Baptist Church, and when he heard the news, he told the crowd what happened, and he left the church. Nearing his house, King saw black people brandishing guns and knives and a barricade of white policemen. And King went inside, and he pushed the crowd in his house to the back room to make sure that Coretta and his 10-week-old baby were okay. And back in the front room of the house, some white reporters were trying to leave to file their stories, but they could not get out of the house, which was surrounded by armed, angry black people. Taylor Branch, in Parting the Waters, tells what happened next. King walked out onto the front porch, holding his hand up for silence. He tried to still the anger by speaking with an exaggerated peacefulness in his voice. Everything was all right, he said. Don't get panicky. Don't do anything panicky. If you have weapons, take them home. If you do not have them, please do not seek to get them. We cannot solve this problem through retaliatory violence. We must meet violence with nonviolence. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword. Remember, that is what Jesus said. We are not advocating violence. We must love our white brothers no matter what they do to us. We must make them know that we love them. Jesus still cries out in words that echo across the centuries. Love your neighbors, bless them that curse you, pray for them that despitefully use you. This is what we must live by. We must meet hate with love. When the crowd of several hundred was silent, he continued, I did not start this boycott. I was asked by you to serve as your spokesman. I want it to be known, the length and breadth of this land, that if I am stopped, this movement will not stop. If I am stopped, our work will not stop. For what we do is right. What we are doing is just, and God is with us. Again, I don't care what anyone says about King's faults. If it were my family that had been bombed, if my wife Carol and our 10-year-old child were harmed in that way, I probably wouldn't be saying we must meet hate with love. I think I wouldn't. But you'd hear me say something more like what Malcolm X would have said. I'd probably be saying, God help you. And I'd mean it. And so would most self-respecting men say the same thing. But you see, it was the fact that King did not say what most men would have said that makes him such a great man. God only knows. He must have felt fear and anger and frustration, but he spoke about peace, justice, and love instead. King could have stayed out of the limelight. He didn't have to do what he did. By 1968, when he was assassinated, his main work was done. For the 5 years before his death, King would alter the face of the Black church. Beginning with the Montgomery boycott, King effected the virtual reversal of Black religious life. Because before King, the Black church had grown increasingly conservative. It might surprise you to know that many Black ministers went on record in opposition to launching a civil disobedience campaign to bring an end to Jim Crow segregation. Of course, this prompted his now famous letter from a Birmingham jail. Martin Luther King helped make the Black church and every American reject discrimination against other Americans because of race or color. According to his family, King was murdered because he was no longer the king of the March on Washington, simply asking for whites only signs to come down. King had grown radical. By 1968, he was trying to build an interracial coalition to end the war in Vietnam, and he was trying to force major economic reforms, starting with guaranteed annual incomes for all. Let me say that again. He was building an interracial coalition to end the war in Vietnam and force major economic reforms, starting with guaranteed annual incomes for all. His family charges that the government feared King might topple the power structure and assassinated him, probably with Lyndon Johnson's knowledge. It turns out there is some strong evidence to support the King family's contentions, primarily that his killer, James Earl Ray, did not act alone. Martin Luther King Jr. was a man who was keenly aware of his place in history and the cost it would exact. Addressing an audience at Bishop Charles J. Manson Temple in Memphis on April 3rd, 1968, King affirmed his optimism despite what he said the difficult days were that lie ahead. And he said, "I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter to me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to go God's will, and He's allowed me to go to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." The following evening, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated as he stood in the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis. So what effect did Martin Luther King Jr. have on the world, one might ask? When I was first starting to write this sermon, I thought it would be hard to find solid evidence of his enduring legacy beyond our shores. However, it is not difficult to read about how powerful the effect of King's actions and words has deeply affected many people worldwide. In an article entitled How Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech changed the world, Nicholas Whipshoot wrote, King's dignified appeal to the better nature of his countrymen had a resonance far wider than just the United States. When he addressed what he called the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation, he would inadvertently set off a worldwide movement for racial emancipation. Tangible evidence of the long march he set off on 50 years ago can be seen in the endless roads and civic facilities around the world, which bear his name, celebrating the American civil rights leaders' universal cry for a more just, generous, and humane world. Among those chosen to speak King's hallowed words and talk of his influence on them was Cesar Chavez, Nelson Mandela, Dalai Lama, Malala, and I'm gonna screw this up, Yousafzai, the 16-year-old Pakistani girl shot in the head by the Taliban for daring to go to school, Maya Angelou, Joan Baez, the voice of the American civil rights movement. So, how did Martin Luther King Jr. save the world? I believe his friend Ralph Abernathy said it best at a speech given at the commemoration service for Martin Luther King Jr. on January 15th, 1969. He said, "He was the redeemer of the soul of America. He taught the nation that an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, if followed to its ultimate conclusion, would only end in a totally blind and toothless society. He discovered that the most potent force for revolution and reform in America is nonviolence. He knew, as the eminent historian Arnold Toynbee has written, that if America is saved, it will be through the black man who will inject new dimensions of nonviolence into the veins of our civilization." And so it was. And that, my dear friends, is how Martin Luther King Jr. saved the world. Namaste.
Thank you, Reverend Lewis. And as we have music for the offertory, I'll invite the worship host to come forward to receive the plates. Your generosity will help the church continue its mission of making love visible. Please rise as you're willing and able for the final hymn, Amazing Grace.
You can sit if you'd like. As we reflect on the tumultuous history of our near past, may we carry with us the resilience and strength of those who endured the shackles of slavery and the pervasive injustice of the Jim Crow era. Let the stories of our ancestors and those who lived through the past 70 years guide us towards a commitment to justice and equality. In the face of adversity, may we draw inspiration from Martin Luther King Jr.'s unwavering courage and his call for nonviolence, understanding that love has the power to conquer hate. So as we depart this sacred space, may we carry the teachings of King beyond these walls. Let us strive to build bridges of understanding, to break down the barriers that perpetuate inequality, and to stand against the forces of racism and discrimination. And I will say that now is the time. In the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr., may our actions be guided by a profound commitment to justice, empathy, and the restorative and transformative power of love. May we work collectively to create a world where every person is treated with dignity and respect, and where the echoes of King's dream resound in the pursuit of a more just and compassionate society. Go now in peace until we meet again.
I think he will. Okay, let's do it. All right, here we go.